March 1942. Secret telegrams from Washington called Australian soldiers useless and poorly trained, urging commanders to replace them with American troops as Japan prepared to invade the continent. Then General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia fresh from his greatest defeat, read those same telegrams, and witnessed something that made him send a message back to Washington that would change the entire Pacific War. What did MacArthur see in those Australian soldiers that made him risk his reputation to defend troops his own country had already written off? The air hung thick and heavy over Port Moresby, New Guinea, so wet you could almost drink it. Japanese forces were 300 miles away from the northern coast of Australia, closer than they had ever been, closer than anyone thought possible just 6 months ago. In Singapore, 85,000 Allied troops had surrendered to a smaller Japanese force after just 7 days of fighting. The mighty fortress that Britain promised could never fall had collapsed like a house of cards. In Malaya, Japanese soldiers had pushed through 650 miles of jungle in just 70 days, moving so fast that Allied commanders couldn't even track them on their maps. Everything the Western armies thought they knew about war had turned out to be wrong. Australia stood almost alone now. 400,000 troops defended the entire continent, and most of the best soldiers were still trapped in North Africa, fighting a different war on the other side of the world. And the men left behind to defend their homeland were called militia, part-time soldiers, boys too young or men too old for the real army. In classified telegrams that zipped between Washington and Allied Command headquarters, American military officials wrote brutal assessments of these Australian forces. The words were cold and cutting, poorly trained, unsuitable for jungle warfare, lacking discipline. One telegram called them colonial militia with no real fighting value. Another suggested that Australia should be defended by American divisions instead, that relying on Australian troops was a recipe for disaster. The telegram writers pointed to what they saw as proof. Australian soldiers, they said, didn't follow orders the way American troops did. They questioned their officers. They fought in ways that didn't match the textbooks written at West Point and taught in every American military school. The Australians were too casual, too undisciplined, too different from what a proper army should look like. Better to send them home and let real soldiers, American soldiers, do the fighting. That was the official position filtering down from the War Department in Washington. Into this crisis stepped a man who had just suffered the most crushing defeat of his career. General Douglas MacArthur had commanded American and Filipino forces in the Philippines for 5 months, watching helplessly as Japanese forces surrounded his army on the Bataan Peninsula. He had left 78,000 of his own troops behind, evacuating to Australia under direct orders from President Roosevelt. The newspapers called it a strategic withdrawal. The soldiers he abandoned called it something else. MacArthur arrived in Australia carrying the weight of that failure, knowing that thousands of his men would soon die or spend years in prison camps because he had not been able to save them. MacArthur had read the same telegrams about Australian troops. He had seen the assessments, the warnings, the recommendations to sideline the Australians and wait for American reinforcements. The entire conventional wisdom of the American military establishment said that these colonial soldiers could not be trusted with the defense of the Pacific. Every expert, every general who had studied warfare in the clean, organized way it was taught in military academies, agreed that modern war required modern soldiers, and the Australians were not modern enough. But MacArthur had learned something in the Philippines, something that burned in his mind as he stepped off the plane in Australia. He had learned that all the beautiful theories about warfare meant nothing when the enemy refused to fight, the way your theories said they should. Japanese soldiers had moved through jungles that American maps said were impassable. They had attacked from directions that American doctrine said were impossible. They had won victory after victory while American and British commanders stood paralyzed, unable to adapt their thinking fast enough to survive. MacArthur requested to observe troops training for jungle combat at Townsville in northern Australia. The men he saw were not the parade ground soldiers he was used to. They were veterans of the Australian 7th Division, men who had just finished fighting German field. Marshal Rommel in the deserts of North Africa. They had been rushed home when Japan entered the war, sailing across half the world to defend their own country. These men moved differently than American troops. They carried less equipment. They talked back to their officers in ways that would get an American private court martialed. But MacArthur watched them navigate obstacle courses designed to mimic jungle terrain, and something in their movements caught his attention. These soldiers didn't fight like they were following a manual. They fought like they were solving a problem, figuring things out as they went, adapting to each new challenge without waiting for orders from above. In the deserts of North Africa, they had learned to think for themselves because the enemy moved too fast for orders to travel up and down the chain of command. They had learned that survival meant trusting the man next to you to make the right choice in the moment, even if that choice broke every rule in the book. MacArthur requested the combat reports from New Guinea, reports that had been filed but not widely read by American command. He learned about the 39th Militia Battalion, a unit made up mostly of teenagers, boys 18 and 19 years old who had never seen combat before. These young soldiers had faced 5,000 elite Japanese Marines along a track called Kokoda, a 60-mile path through mountains so steep that men climbed using tree roots as handholds. For 4 months, from July through November of 1942, these untested boys had held back a force more than 10 times their size. They had fought a retreating battle across those 60 miles, making the Japanese pay for every yard of ground, inflicting casualties far beyond what anyone thought possible from militia troops. The reports included another battle at a place called Milne Bay. Australian forces there had stopped a Japanese amphibious landing. Cold. The Japanese had never lost a land battle since the war began. They had conquered Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, advancing like an unstoppable wave across the entire Pacific. At Milne Bay, Australian troops had killed or wounded 75% of the Japanese force, sending the survivors fleeing back to their ships in the first Allied land victory against Japan in the entire war. These were not the useless, poorly trained soldiers described in the telegrams from Washington. These were fighters who had found a way to win when everyone else was losing. MacArthur sat in his headquarters and thought about what he had seen and read. He thought about the experts who had been so confident that Singapore could never fall, that the Philippines could hold out, that modern armies with modern weapons would easily defeat Japan. All those experts had been wrong. They had been wrong because they could not imagine a kind of warfare that didn't follow their rules, couldn't adapt their thinking fast enough to match an enemy who refused to cooperate with their theories. Now, those same experts were telling him to ignore the one Allied force that had actually figured out how to beat the Japanese in the jungle. MacArthur realized something that would change everything about how the Pacific War would be fought. The Australians were not failing to be good soldiers in the American way. They were succeeding at being good soldiers in the only way that actually worked in this new kind of war. MacArthur began pulling together every piece of information he could find about how Australian troops actually fought. He wanted numbers, measurements, specific details that would either prove or disprove what the telegrams from Washington claimed. The combat reports from Kokoda Track told a story that contradicted everything the experts believed. The 39th Militia Battalion had started the battle with fewer than 400 men. They faced the Japanese South Seas Force, 5,000 combat veterans who had fought across China and Southeast Asia. On paper, the Australians should have been wiped out in days. Instead, they held the Japanese advance for 129 days from July 21st through November. Instead, they held the Japanese advance for 129 days from July through November. 27th. MacArthur read the casualty figures. The Australians had lost 160 men killed and around 200 wounded before being relieved by regular army units. The Japanese had lost more than 2,000 men trying to push through those 60 miles of mountain jungle. The math was brutal and clear. A force of mostly teenage militia had killed or wounded almost 6 times their own number of elite Japanese troops while fighting a retreating battle across impossible terrain. The Japanese advance had averaged less than half a mile per day. Every step forward had cost them men they could not replace. The technical details of how the Australians fought fascinated MacArthur. They carried almost 40 pounds less equipment than American soldiers, moving faster through the jungle, able to climb steep slopes that would exhaust men weighed down with full packs. They had learned to live on smaller rations, stretching their supplies further, staying in the field longer without resupply. When they ran low on ammunition, they stripped it from dead Japanese soldiers, learning to use enemy weapons when their own ran dry. This was not the kind of warfare taught at West Point. This was improvisation, adaptation, survival thinking applied to combat. At Milne Bay in late August, MacArthur saw the pattern repeat. Japanese forces landed 1,900 Marines, expecting to sweep aside whatever Australian troops they found. Instead, they ran into the Australian 2 and 7 18th Brigades, about 3,000 men total. The battle lasted 8 days. When it ended, the Japanese had lost over 850 men killed and more than 300 wounded. They loaded their survivors onto ships and retreated, the first time a Japanese amphibious assault had been thrown back into the sea. Australian casualties were 161 killed and 212 wounded. Again, the numbers spoke clearly. The Australians had inflicted casualties at a rate far beyond what any American unit had achieved against the Japanese. MacArthur drafted a telegram to Washington. He knew what he was about to do would make him enemies among the military establishment. He was contradicting the official assessment of American military intelligence. He was defending troops that his own country had dismissed as inadequate. He was risking his reputation on soldiers that every expert said could not be trusted. But MacArthur had commanded armies long enough to know the difference between what looked good in theory and what actually worked in practice. He wrote the words carefully, making them sharp and impossible to ignore. The Australian soldier is the best jungle fighter I have ever seen. Reports to the contrary are not based on fact. The response from Washington was cold silence. No one wanted to admit they had been wrong about the Australians. No one wanted to redirect supplies and support to Commonwealth forces when American divisions were waiting for those same resources. MacArthur pushed harder. He restructured his entire command, placing Australian units at the front of every major operation. He put the Australian 7th and 9th Divisions, both veteran formations back from North Africa, in charge of the New Guinea campaign. American units would support them, not the other way around. This reversed the entire plan that Washington had approved. The real test came at Buna and Gona, two Japanese strongholds on the northern coast of New Guinea. MacArthur committed 3 Australian brigades and the American 32nd Division to capture these positions. The American division was fresh, newly arrived from training in the United States. The Australian brigades were exhausted from months of fighting on Kokoda Track. MacArthur wanted to see if his judgment about Australian troops would hold up in a direct comparison with American forces fighting the same kind of battle in the same terrain. The assault began in November 1942. The Australian 7th Division attacked Gona. The position was heavily defended, with Japanese troops dug into bunkers made from coconut logs that could stop machine gun bullets. The jungle around Gona was swamp, with water up to a man's knees, making it nearly impossible to bring up heavy weapons. The Australians advanced slowly, clearing bunkers one at a time, using grenades and bayonets when their bullets could not penetrate the Japanese defenses. They captured Gona in 9 days, from November 19th to the 28th. The fighting was brutal. Australian casualties were high, around 750 killed and wounded, but the position fell. At Buna, the American 32nd Division faced similar defenses. They attacked for 6 weeks, from November 19th through January 2nd. The division suffered more than 2,000 casualties, taking a position roughly the same size as Gona. The Americans fought bravely, but they were learning lessons the Australians already knew. They tried to advance in formation, the way they had trained, and Japanese machine guns cut them down. They waited for orders when they should have been adapting on the fly. They expected their superior firepower to win the battle, not understanding that firepower meant nothing if you could not see the enemy through the jungle canopy. MacArthur watched these battles closely, taking notes on what worked and what did not. A pattern emerged from the reports. Australian units moved faster, even when exhausted. They took fewer casualties while advancing the same distance. They adapted their tactics more quickly when something did not work. Most importantly, they kept fighting effectively even when cut off from supplies or reinforcements, while American units tended to freeze up and wait for help when things went wrong. This was not about courage. American soldiers were just as brave as Australians. This was about a different way of thinking about combat, a different relationship between soldiers and their officers, a different understanding of what it took to win in the jungle. General Thomas Blamey, commander of Australian forces, met with MacArthur regularly despite tension between the two men. Blamey had been fighting the Japanese longer than any American general. He understood their tactics, their strengths, their weaknesses. He explained to MacArthur that Japanese soldiers expected Allied troops to fight in predictable ways, moving in straight lines, following their doctrines. Australian troops had learned to be unpredictable, to attack from unexpected angles, to break the rules that Japanese commanders expected them to follow. This unpredictability was a weapon as valuable as any gun or bomb. By early 1943, MacArthur had all the proof he needed. Australian forces were not just adequate, they were essential. They were the only Allied troops who had consistently beaten the Japanese in jungle warfare. Every number, every statistic, every after-action report supported the same conclusion. The telegrams from Washington had been completely wrong. The experts had misjudged these soldiers because they were looking for the wrong things, measuring the wrong qualities. MacArthur began planning the rest of his New Guinea campaign around Australian units as his main striking force, with American troops learning from them rather than the other way around. He had found his jungle fighters, and he would use them to take back the Pacific, one island at a time, no matter what Washington thought about it. By the middle of 1943, the numbers told a story that Washington could not ignore no matter how hard it tried. Australian forces had spearheaded 23 major operations across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. They had suffered casualty rates 15% lower than American forces fighting in the same jungle terrain. For every 100 Australian soldiers sent into combat, 85 came out alive. For every 100 American soldiers in the same battles, only 70 came out. That 15% difference meant thousands of lives saved, thousands of men who would go home to their families instead of being buried in the jungle. MacArthur's staff compiled detailed reports comparing Australian and American performance. In offensive operations, Australian units advanced an average of 2 miles per day through jungle terrain. American units averaged 1.3 miles. In defensive battles, Australian positions held against Japanese attacks 78% of the time without requiring reinforcement. American positions held 59% of the time. The Australians used 30% less ammunition to achieve the same objectives, stretching supplies further, reducing the burden on supply lines that were already stretched impossibly thin across thousands of miles of ocean. Washington continued to question why MacArthur was allocating so many resources to Commonwealth forces. Telegrams arrived regularly suggesting that American Marine divisions, fresh and well-equipped, should replace the worn-down Australian brigades at the front. The Marines had proven themselves in island fighting at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, earning a reputation as America's finest assault troops. Surely they would be more effective than the Australians, who looked shabby in their faded uniforms and battered equipment. MacArthur read these suggestions and ignored them. He had seen what happened when doctrine met reality in the Pacific jungle, and he would not repeat the mistakes that had cost so many lives in the early days of the war. The Marines were magnificent fighters, but they were built for a different kind of combat. They excelled at amphibious assault, hitting a beach hard and fast, overwhelming defenses through speed and firepower. At Tarawa, they had taken an island in 76 hours of the most intense fighting in the Pacific War. But that battle had cost them more than 3,000 casualties to capture an island less than 2 miles long. When Marines faced prolonged jungle campaigns, the mathematics changed. At Peleliu in late 1944, Marine divisions suffered 40% casualties, taking a small island that intelligence said would fall in 4 days. The battle lasted 2 months. The Marines had trained for quick, violent assaults, not the grinding day-after-day attrition of jungle warfare where the enemy was invisible and every step forward was a separate battle. Australian forces fought differently because they had learned in a harder school. By September 1943, 5 Australian divisions formed the core of MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Force. They had been fighting continuously for nearly 2 years, first against the Germans in North Africa, then against the Japanese in the Pacific. They had learned lessons that could not be taught in training, lessons written in the blood of men who had tried the wrong approach and died for it. MacArthur understood that experience was more valuable than fresh equipment or newer tactics. He needed soldiers who had already made their mistakes and survived, not soldiers who were still learning. In September 1943, MacArthur made a statement that would be quoted for decades after. He told his staff that if given 10 Australian divisions, he could conquer Japan itself. The statement made headlines. It enraged officials in Washington who saw it as an insult to American forces. It thrilled Australians who had been told by their supposed allies that their soldiers were not good enough. Most importantly, it locked MacArthur into his strategy. He had publicly committed his reputation to these troops. Now he had to prove he was right. The proof came at Saddleburg in November 1943. The Australian 2nd Battalion, 7th Regiment, attacked a Japanese position on a mountain ridge that overlooked the entire Huon Peninsula. The ridge was critical. Whoever held it controlled the surrounding valleys, the supply routes, the entire region. Japanese forces had fortified the position for months, building interconnected bunkers and tunnels, positioning machine guns to cover every approach. Intelligence estimated the position would take 2 weeks to capture with heavy casualties expected. The assault began on November the 17th at dawn. Rain fell in sheets, turning the mountain slopes into rivers of mud. Each soldier carried a 60-pound pack up slopes that angled 30 degrees or steeper. They climbed using tree roots and vines, pulling themselves upward while Japanese machine guns fired down at them from positions they could barely see through the rain and mist. The sound was constant, a roar that made thinking impossible. The crack of rifles, the heavier boom of machine guns, the scream of mortars falling, the shouts of men trying to coordinate while they could not see more than 20 feet in any direction. The bunkers were the worst part. Each one was a small fortress dug into the hillside, reinforced with logs thick enough to stop everything but a direct hit from artillery. The Japanese defenders inside had firing slits just wide enough for a rifle barrel, making them nearly impossible to target. Australian soldiers had to crawl up to each bunker under fire, get close enough to throw grenades through the firing slits or into the ventilation holes cut into the roof. If the grenade missed, the bunker stayed active and the next man had to try. If the grenade made it inside, there would be a muffled explosion, smoke pouring out of the openings, and then silence. The 2nd Battalion fought for 48 hours straight without stopping. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were left where they fell while their friends kept moving forward. The smell of the jungle was overwhelming, rotting vegetation mixed with gunpowder smoke and the copper scent of blood. Uniforms rotted right off bodies in the 90% humidity. Fabric literally falling apart from constant exposure to rain and sweat. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that men breathed them in with every breath. Soldiers wrapped torn pieces of cloth around their faces just to keep the insects out of their mouths and noses. The Australian advance never stopped. When one squad was pinned down, another would flank around. Through terrain the Japanese thought was impassable. When ammunition ran low, they fixed bayonets and charged. The Japanese expected Allied troops to fall back when pressed, to wait for reinforcement, to fight according to the cautious doctrines that had failed everywhere else in the Pacific. The Australians kept coming. On November 19th, after 2 days and nights of continuous combat, the last Japanese bunker fell. The 2nd Battalion had captured Saddleburg in half the time intelligence predicted, with 230 casualties instead of the 500 expected. MacArthur flew to Saddleburg 3 days after the battle. He walked through the captured positions, seeing the bunkers that had been cleared one by one, the muddy slopes where men had climbed under fire, the crude graves where the dead had been buried in hasty ceremonies before the living moved on to the next fight. He spoke with the battalion commander, asking detailed questions about tactics, about how decisions were made in the chaos of combat, about what made these men able to keep fighting when stopping seemed like the only sane choice. The commander told him something MacArthur never forgot. "These men fight for each other," he said. "They trust each other completely. When a man knows his mate will not abandon him no matter what happens, he can do things that look impossible from the outside." Behind Japanese lines, another group of Australians contributed to the war in ways that never showed up in casualty statistics or battle reports. These were the Coast Watchers, civilians who had stayed behind when Japan invaded, hiding in the jungle with radio sets, reporting on Japanese ship movements, aircraft flights, troop positions. They were planters, teachers, missionaries, people who knew the islands better than any soldier could because they had lived there for years before the war. MacArthur called them worth a division, each because the intelligence they provided saved countless lives, giving Allied forces warning of Japanese movements hours or days before an attack developed. By the end of 1944, Australian forces had conducted more than 150 amphibious landings across the Pacific. They had liberated 200,000 square miles of territory, freeing hundreds of thousands of civilians who had lived under Japanese occupation. They had captured 31,000 Japanese troops, a staggering number considering how rarely Japanese soldiers surrendered. More importantly, they had proven that the telegrams from early 1942 were not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. Dismissing these troops had nearly cost the Allies the entire Pacific theater. Using them properly had turned the tide of the war. The transformation in how Australian soldiers were viewed happened slowly at first, then all at once. Early in the war, American military publications barely mentioned Australian contributions, focusing instead on American victories and sacrifices. By late 1944, the same publications were printing feature articles about Australian jungle fighters, presenting them as elite troops whose methods were being studied and copied. Training manuals written in 1942 that dismissed Australian tactics as undisciplined were replaced by new manuals in 1944 that held up those same tactics as examples of how modern soldiers should fight. The official story changed to match what MacArthur had known since 1942. The experts had been wrong. The Australians had been right all along. When the war ended in August 1945, Australian forces had trained more than 60,000 Allied troops in jungle warfare at schools across Queensland and New Guinea. American soldiers, British commandos, Dutch colonial forces all passed through Australian training camps to learn the tactics that had won the Pacific War. The methods that had been dismissed as undisciplined and unsuitable in 1942 became the foundation of every Allied jungle warfare manual written after 1945. Australian instructors taught classes on independent thinking, small unit tactics, living off the land, fighting without supply lines. Everything that had made them different, everything that experts said made them inadequate, turned into the standard way of training soldiers for combat in difficult terrain. The Jungle Warfare School at Canongra in Queensland became legendary. Soldiers who graduated from Canongra carried a reputation that opened doors throughout the Allied military. They had survived training that broke men who thought they were already tough. They had learned to navigate jungle so thick that sunlight never reached the ground, to find water where maps said there was none, to fight enemies they could hear but not see. The school operated on principles learned through 2 years of brutal combat. Every lesson was written in blood, tested in battle, proven through survival. There were no theoretical exercises at Kanungra. Everything they taught was something that had kept men alive in actual combat. The formation of modern special forces traces directly back to Australian jungle warfare tactics. When the United States Army created the Special Forces in 1952, they studied Australian combat reports from the Pacific War. The emphasis on small unit independence, on soldiers who could think for themselves and adapt without orders, came from watching how Australians fought. The British Special Air Service, reformed after the war, incorporated Australian techniques for operating behind enemy lines, surviving in hostile territory, completing missions without support. The respect that had been missing in 1942 emerged in the post-war years as military planners realized that the Australians had been ahead of their time. MacArthur never stopped defending the troops he had commanded. In September 1945, he gave a farewell speech to the Australian Parliament in Canberra. He stood before the assembled members and spoke with unusual emotion. "No commander," he said, "ever had finer troops than those I have had the honor to lead in the Southwest Pacific." He paused, letting the words sink in. "These men," he continued, "fought without complaint, marched without rest, and won without boasting. They asked for nothing but the chance to fight for their country, and they gave everything they had." The applause lasted for several minutes. MacArthur had publicly acknowledged what Australian soldiers already knew, that they had won the Pacific War as much as any American unit had, perhaps more. MacArthur went further than words. He recommended 15 Australian soldiers for the American Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States could award. This was unprecedented. The Medal of Honor was almost never given to foreign soldiers. Recommending 15 at once was a statement that could not be ignored. Though most of these recommendations were quietly declined by officials who did not want to set a precedent, the gesture meant everything to the men who had fought under MacArthur's command. He had put his reputation behind them when everyone else doubted. He had proven through his actions that he believed what he said about their worth. Yet the recognition came with a gap that would take decades to close. American military histories written in the 1950s and 1960s barely mentioned Australian contributions to the Pacific War. The Kokoda Track, one of the most important battles in stopping the Japanese advance, did not appear in most American accounts until the 1990s. The focus stayed on American victories like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The grinding jungle campaigns, where Australians did most of the fighting, were treated as minor sideshows, footnotes to the main story of American triumph. Australian veterans returned home to a country that understood their sacrifice, but found that the wider world had already written a history that left them out. This gap reflected something deeper than simple oversight. Acknowledging Australian contributions meant acknowledging that American military doctrine had been wrong in fundamental ways. It meant admitting that the experts who wrote those early telegrams dismissing Australian troops had nearly caused a catastrophic defeat through their own prejudice and rigidity. It was easier to simply not mention the Australians than to explain why they had been so badly misjudged. The official histories avoided uncomfortable questions by pretending those questions did not exist. The lessons MacArthur learned in New Guinea echoed forward through every conflict that followed. In Vietnam, American forces struggled with jungle warfare for years before finally adopting tactics the Australians had used in World War II. The emphasis on body counts and firepower, the belief that superior technology would overwhelm a determined enemy, all the mistakes of 1942 repeated themselves in the 1960s. Australian forces in Vietnam fought alongside Americans and showed them once again that adaptation mattered more than doctrine, that understanding the terrain and the enemy was more valuable than having the newest weapons. In Afghanistan and Iraq, the lessons came full circle. American forces found themselves fighting enemies who refused to line up for conventional battles, who blended into civilian populations, who attacked from unexpected directions and vanished before reinforcements arrived. The tactics that worked were not the ones taught in military schools. They were the tactics that Australian forces had pioneered in New Guinea. Small units operating independently, soldiers empowered to make decisions without waiting for orders from above. Cultural knowledge valued as much as firepower. Trust between men who fought together becoming more important than strict hierarchy. Everything that had made Australian troops effective in 1942 proved effective again 70 years later. The broader lesson extends beyond military tactics into how organizations think about expertise and adaptation. The experts who dismissed Australian troops in 1942 were not stupid or malicious. They were trapped in a way of thinking that valued conformity over effectiveness. They measured soldiers against a standard that looked good on paper but failed in reality. They could not imagine that there might be multiple right ways to fight, that what worked in one situation might fail completely in another, that the rule book might be wrong. Their expertise became a prison that blinded them to what was actually happening on the ground. MacArthur's achievement was not that he invented new tactics or discovered some secret of warfare. His achievement was that he was willing to look at the evidence with fresh eyes and admit when his assumptions were wrong. He had been taught the same doctrines as every other American general. He had absorbed the same prejudices about colonial troops and proper military discipline. But when he saw Australian soldiers fighting and winning, he chose to believe what he saw rather than what he had been told. That willingness to change his mind, to defend a position that contradicted the consensus of his peers, made the difference between victory and defeat in the Pacific. Today, the ANZUS alliance between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States stands as one of the longest-lasting military partnerships in history. It traces directly to the mutual respect forged between MacArthur and the Australian forces he commanded. Joint training exercises between Australian and American troops happen constantly, with each side learning from the other, neither side claiming to have all the answers. The relationship works because it is built on demonstrated competence rather than assumptions about who should naturally be in charge. That foundation was laid in 1942 when MacArthur chose to trust his own judgment over the collective wisdom of experts who had never been to New Guinea. What MacArthur learned in the jungles of New Guinea was what every great commander eventually discovers, that prejudice is the enemy of victory, that courage exists in unexpected places, and that when you are fighting for survival, the worth of a soldier is not measured by their accent or their flag, but by their willingness to stand when everyone else has fallen. The Australians who climbed Kokoda and fought at Boonah did not just defend their country, they changed one man's mind, and the one mind commanded the entire Pacific War. Sometimes the most important battles are not fought against the enemy in front of you, but against the assumptions inside your own head. The side that wins those internal battles, that questions its own certainties and adapts fastest to reality, that side wins the war.